So hello everybody. I guess there's a second day in a row that we're doing this. I guess that I'm doing this. Yesterday I did a little overview of what it's like to be a SharePoint developer, kind of how you get started and the tool set, how you get your own environment set up. Like Amanda said, in this module or in this session, I want to spend a little more time going into a little more depth on two very common things: data access being the read part of data access and the write part. So I'm going to spend more on the read part because that's a little more common and talk to you about the different options. Got a couple of questions yesterday about slides, or when there was nothing to show you and just looking at a desktop. So I threw 4 slides together just so you at least have something. So I'm not going to go through introduction because Amanda just did that. Our company, we just do SharePoint training. So if you're interested, you can go to criticalpathtraining.com, and then there's a bunch of other ways you can follow. So I'll come back to this slide at the very end so that you can see this while any questions are going on. All right. I'll also try to answer questions during the session. If I skip your question, I'll try to come back to it at the end. I just want to make sure I get through everything I want to cover primarily. So let's first tackle the first side, which is the more common side, at least that we're probably most familiar with, and that's the server-side data access in SharePoint 2010. We have 2 options available to us on how you can get data in and out of SharePoint when you're working on the server. When I say on the server, I mean like you've built something that's running inside of the server that's hosting SharePoint. So you've built a web part, or you were building a console application that's going to run on the server. In a second, we'll talk more of the client access and the options that you have when you have code that wants to talk to SharePoint but from a different machine. It may be the client machine using JavaScript or Silverlight. It may be another server, like say an SAP server or some other ASP.NET website that needs to get in and talk to SharePoint. So we'll look at the client side in just a minute. So on the server side, we have 2 options. We have something called Camel and we have LINQ. Now, Camel, for those of you who are not familiar with SharePoint, what Microsoft did is that everything is stored inside of SQL Server databases. However, we're not allowed to go to those databases. We're not allowed to touch them or read from them. I'm sure that there's at least one person on this webinar who's thinking about it and just saying, oh, please. I know Microsoft says don't go to the database, but I know how to write a SQL query. I'm a really good SQL person. I have no problems with it. I've been doing SharePoint for, I guess, oh my God, I guess now I look at the date, about 8 years now. No wonder I've got so much gray hair. But I can tell you just from experience that I have seen even the highest level support cases come through Microsoft when someone gets just doing a single and very simple and what would seem to be a harmless select statement. I've seen those statements actually come back and pull back 50 megs of data because of just some automatic stuff that's going on inside the database. What Microsoft did instead is they gave us a very rich API to get data out, and they give us a language to get the data out through the API called Camel. Camel is very similar to like a standard SQL statement in the sense that you have a select portion, a from portion, and a where portion. But what's different is that you express a Camel statement as XML. It stands for Collaborative Application Markup Language. So you build these queries that look like that are XML, and it's very cumbersome, and it can be very cumbersome and very challenging to write. It's not that bad to read it, but it definitely can be challenging to write. So some people went out and built some tools that let us visually build a query, and then it would generate the Camel for us. This is the fastest way to get data out of SharePoint. Now, the other option that we have that was introduced in SharePoint 2010 is LINQ. And what the product team did is they basically just built a LINQ provider for SharePoint. This thing is going to work. You can think of it as working almost the exact same way as the provider that LINQ has for SQL Server. Not the Entity Framework stuff, but just pure SQL Server. In the sense that you have to go through as a developer, the provider is going to be an abstraction on top of another language. So like for SQL, the LINQ provider for SQL Server is an abstraction of the SQL Server, the T-SQL code that's going to be written. So your your LINQ queries you write get translated to T-SQL. The same is true in SharePoint, where our queries that we write in LINQ for SharePoint are going to get translated into CAML under the covers. And by the same notion, too, the way that SQL works, you have to generate one of these entity contexts so that you can see so that LINQ understands the schema that it's talking to. We have to do the same thing in SharePoint. We have to go through and run this tool called SP Metal that will generate an entity model that we can use inside of our code. Okay. And one thing just to point out, just the same way how SQL works, because it's an abstraction, and because that this guy is actually building camel queries, technically he is a little bit slower, and you do take a bit of a performance hit, but it's a negligible one. It's not one that is that big of a deal. You're going to be taking that performance hit for the benefit of improved productivity, the same reason we use .NET over writing C++ code, right? So there is going to be a bit of a performance hit, but you're going to be a lot more productive. The other thing the entity model gives us is a full-blown, strongly typed object that's going to give us strongly typed objects for all the collections or lists, and then for each one of the items that we can put inside of lists. So it'll be nice, strong type stuff. In just a minute, we're going to build a web part that is going to use the LINQ for SharePoint to get the data out. Okay. Now, the other option that we have to getting data out of SharePoint is using is from the client side. Now, we've got three different options that are available to us here. Okay, and it really depends on the technology that you're using. So, SharePoint, since SharePoint 2003, we've had traditional web services to standard ASMX style web services to get data out. I'm assuming most people here have not used are not very experienced SharePoint developers. It's kind of the reason why we're doing this with DevExpress. And I'll tell you that working with data on the server and then going to use the web services, it feels like you're using two totally different products. Working with a list, like with Camel, and then going to use the list style web service, I mean, everything is different. It's really frustrating to the point where a lot of us just avoided web services as much as we could. Then the other options that we have, though, that are available to us in SharePoint 2010 are the ClientObject Model and then the REST interface that we have. Now, for the ClientObject Model, these two things are very similar. The ClientObject Model has three implementations. There's a .NET version that you can use in, like, say, a WPF app or a console app, or if you're running some Windows Win32 type service. And then there's also ones that you can run in the browser using Silverlight or ECMAScript. Silverlight works in Silverlight 3 and up. ECMAScript, really just JavaScript. It's written in a really nice encapsulated library that can work very well side by side with jQuery. So if at the end, if somebody's interested to see a sample of how it works with jQuery, just remind me at the very end, and I can point you to a place where you can go grab some samples so you can see what that looks like. What the ClientObject Model is going to do is that it's going to be a library that you're going to add a reference to in your project, and behind the scenes, it's going to talk to SharePoint through WCF, and it's going to give you a way to do a lot of the stuff you're used to doing on the server within a SharePoint site or a site collection, but you can do it all from the client. So this includes standard data access stuff, so reading and writing from SharePoint lists. But you can also create lists. You could manage the security permissions inside the site, creating content types, kicking off workflows, mucking around with the navigation. There's a lot of stuff that you can do. One of the things that just to keep in mind here is that because the ClientObject Model is a pre-generated library that Microsoft provides, the library has no knowledge of the underlying data that you're talking to. So if you have a list with a couple fields in it, the ClientObject Model doesn't know the schema of that list, and so you have to work with that list by pulling things out using named indexers and also calling lists out by name. So there's no strong typing or anything like that in it. There's no entity model or anything like that that you can go pre-generate for the ClientObject Model. but we can not just do data access, we can do a lot of other stuff, as I just mentioned. The other thing that Microsoft did is they added in a RESTful service, or of course, it depends on who you're talking to today, but a RESTful service, an OData service, a WCF data service, they're really all the same, right? What they did is that they include this as part of the product when you install SharePoint 2010, but it doesn't work right out of the box. That's because you need something extra to turn on to enable WCF data services with the .NET framework. .NET 3.5 SP1, which is what SharePoint has a requirement for, a prerequisite for. So when you install this, you install SharePoint, right off the bat, the RESTful service won't work. That's because you need to go get this extra add-on and install it. There's this nice little prereq installer for SharePoint that installs everything you need, but it doesn't install this. And I guess there's a lot of us that have given Microsoft quite a bit of feedback or criticism. I guess feedback is the polite way to say it, that it makes no sense not to put this on there. But their point, well, whatever. Their point was that it didn't make sense because you're updating the .NET framework, and it's not really something that SharePoint requires. Now, what's different about using the RESTful model from the ClientObject Model option is that the RESTful model is very much like every other kind of web service you're going to use or other RESTful services. When you add a reference to that service inside of Visual Studio, it's going to create a strongly typed proxy that's going to have objects for all the collections and all the kinds of objects that can go inside of those collections. So that's going to give me the ability to write LINQ queries against the RESTful service, all right, and have a much more strongly typed way of going through and reading and writing data. The RESTful service, though, is limited to only reading and writing from existing SharePoint lists. So you can create a brand new list in the browser and add some fields to it, and then go to the RESTful service, and you'll see that list and that data, and you can read and write to it. But from the service, you can't create a brand new list or add columns to that list the same way you could do with the ClientObject Model. So there's some similarities there, yet they're also very different. I'm a little bit more of a fan when I'm reading and writing data. I'm much more of a fan of the RESTful service. The ClientObject Model does have a little bit better performance, but I find the RESTful model a little bit better because then people who don't know SharePoint, they don't need to know that they're talking to SharePoint. They just need to know they're talking to a RESTful service. Okay. Now I see one question that came in before. Let me see if I had. Yeah, that was all my slides. So we're going to go in and jump into. Whoa, hold on. We're going to jump into. I hit the wrong button. There we go. We're going to jump into Visual Studio now. I got one question here. Let's see from. Oh, I'm not even going to try for that one. The question is, would you use SP-Metal or SP-LINQ for real-time development on the server? Any reservations or best practices to keep in mind? Or should we stick with the old model of using column names? I personally like to use the new LINQ support that we have in SharePoint quite a bit. The reason being is because I find I'm a lot more productive that way. Now, the challenge with this, the one thing that people usually come up with, there's two big gripes that people have with this model. One is they say, well, it's not as fast as the camel model. Yeah, that's true, but I mean, it's a level of abstraction that's helping you with performance. So, or sorry, with productivity. So you're getting a bit of a trade-off, and the people that get all bent out of shape about that, I mean, it's just they have to look and understand, well, why are you using the .NET framework? I think that the benefit of productivity is going to win that battle. Obviously, if you need something that is very fast, then you probably want to stick with the camel model. The other challenge that people come up with, which is true, is that, well, what happens if they change the schema of the list that I'm talking to after I've built my entity model? Well, I mean, same kind of thing. What happens if you change the database schema, and does your application break? Well, it depends. If you added a column, if it's not required, then really nothing really breaks. If it was required, then your deletes are going to work just fine, your selects are going to work just fine, but your inserts and updates are probably going to break. So it really just depends. The challenge that SharePoint presents is that it brings the ability to modify the schema of lists much closer to the surface for your users. But you can manage who can modify lists and stuff all through permissions right out of the box. So it's not that bad, okay? Okay, I see you had a follow-up question. I'm going to come back to that. I want to go ahead and kind of jump into actually trying to build something since we've been going for about 18 minutes now, so you guys can actually see something. Okay, so what I have here is I have a standard SharePoint site, and I created a sub-site here called ClientObject Model, and that just gives me, you can't really tell there's much of a difference except for in the URL. But the big thing that gives me is that gives me two lists that I created previously, one called product categories, which contains all the categories that are available for different products, and then a products list. I'm going to just use this products list as basically the thing that we're going to read and write to. Okay, so just a bunch of information here. So I'm going to come over here to Visual Studio, and all I've done, let's go through and close that. All I've done here is just create two new projects. I created a project. This is I think it's a WPF application. No, that's a sorry, we're going to start with server-side data access. My server-side data access project that you see here is a SharePoint empty project. And what I did is I have this batch file here, and what this batch file does is he's going to run this utility called SP-Metal, which you'll find at this nice, easy-to-find location. I say that tongue-in-cheek. You're going to run SP-Metal, so I'm going to run SP-Metal. I'm going to tell it what SharePoint site I want to run it against. What is the code file I want it to gen? I want to do that. What code file do I want to generate? Where's my entity model? And then I have this optional thing here of parameters to pass in an XML file. Now, what happens is that SP-Metal, what it's going to do by default is generate an entity model for every single list, library, and content type inside of the ClientObject Model site. But if I pass in this parameters file right here, what this is going to allow me to do, which is really helpful here, is that I'm going to be able to go in and say, I only want to go through and generate entities for two entity models for two of the lists inside of that site, and I want to exclude everything else. So I don't want to go through and deal with the document libraries or any of that other stuff. I'm just interested in these two guys, okay? So I'm going to run that batch file. It's going to generate this code file here called ClientObject Model Entities. And if I just open him up and look at this little list here, you'll see that I've got a property for products and a property for products, okay? We're going through and doing this. Now, I'm going to go through and just leave this thing as is, just as a reference to my project here. What I want to do now is I want to go in and show you how we can use this guy. So let's go over here to the server-side data access. And yesterday I showed you how we can go through and add a new visual web part. So I'll go add a new visual web part, and we'll just call it, we'll just call it web part, visual web part 1. That's fine. And it'll stub out everything we need. Now, the other thing that I'm going to need to do here is that I'm going to use LINQ. I want to add a reference to the, wait for my refreshing references to finish. And I will say, let's just search for link, and there's a SharePoint link right here, and I'll say add, and say remove or close. See a question, somebody came in, somebody asked, can you have the source code at the very end? If you say please, then I might do it. I'm just kidding. Yes, at the very end, what I'll do is later today, I will put it up on the, I'll go through and put it on my blog. So if you just go to andrewcollin.com, just watch my blog, and I'll put a post up with the link to where you can grab it, okay? Please, please. That works. Okay, so this visual web part here is going to load this user control and add it to the controls collection. So let's go into the user control that's going to create here. And let's see. So I'm sorry, I was on the wrong thing here. Okay, here we go. So you can see that it's going to load in this user control right here into the controls collection. So this is all Visual Studio 2010. You have to use Visual Studio 2010 for SharePoint 2010. Now, I'm going to come over here to the ASCX file here, and I'm just going to add a drop-down list. And we'll call it products drop-down list. See a couple questions coming in. I'm gonna come back to those when I finish this web part. When we have there's a second one. This thing is building and deploying. I'll explain it. I'll answer some of those questions. All right, so I've got my drop-down list. So what I want to do is show a list of products. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to come back over here to my code behind, and in the page load, I'll just go through and we'll go through and create a new, we'll set up a new way to go. We'll pull the data back using our LINQ entity model that we just generated. Now, these client object model, these entities, these are in something called a data context, right? So I'm going to have to create a new client object model entities data context. So there's my data context. And I will say new data context and pass in the URL of my site that I want to connect to, all right? So the entity model generated it very much like how SQL works. We want to pass in a connection string. Think of this as like my connection string. So this way I can have it work between production and a development system, okay? This guy is also a disposable object, so using my favorite refactoring tool, refactoring code rush, I'm going to go through and just set up a using statement. And now I'm going to go through and write my query. So we'll say var query from product and dc.products. We need to do using system.link. Let's say order by p.title select p. And just for kicks, let's go through and let's do a little bit of filtering here. Where or while p.title, and we'll switch it over to lower, where it starts with the letter A. Letter M, how's that? I don't think I have any A products in there. The next thing I want to do here is I want to go through and I want to add him to that drop-down list. So we'll just go to our products drop-down list, its data source, and because it's LINQ, we know it's an enumerable collection, so we can just bind straight to it. I can do the products drop-down list. We'll set the text field. Trying to go too quick there. The title. The products drop-down list, we'll set them to the data value field, and then we'll just say, let's just data bind. Right? Let's just build them, make sure everything looks good. Build progress exceeded. Okay, so I'll just go through and say, let's debug this guy. Debug, start new instance. So while that's going, let me come over here and take a look at the questions we got. So let's see. Yeah, which Visual Studio version is being used? This is Visual Studio 2010. And it's working off .NET 3.5 SP1. Yesterday I talked about kind of more of an overview of SharePoint development, and one of the things we talked about was that SharePoint is not supported on .NET 4. Microsoft hasn't said when or even if they're going to do that. They've been mum on that, so we'll have to see. Let's see. Can the entities generated by SP Metal be serialized so they can be stored in the view state? That's a great question. I don't know off the top of my head. I think so. So I'm not totally certain. I have to check on that. Let's see here. Somebody, the question that came up earlier about using SP Metal and SharePoint LINQ or LINQ for SharePoint on real-time on the development. They had a follow-up that says, what about issues like missing fields, attachments, dealing with multiple site columns and master columns, serializable? Okay, so that's like the one question that's got parts A through M. It all just depends on what changes on the schema that your entity model has been generated from. The same way that if you change your schema on your database, what happens to your entity framework model? What happens to your model that you generate with SP Metal? It just depends on what you changed, how you changed it, what you did, and how you're using it. So you just have to kind of see. Okay. So sorry I can't give you a more detailed answer there, but it really just depends. Let's see, while this is coming up, it should be up in a second, but one more question. Using the client object model, can I access production site data from my development machine? Sure, because a client object model is going to be reaching out via WCF, via web services. It's transparent to you, but you'll see that you're going to pass in a URL and say what you're going to basically pass in a connection string into the client object model and tell it which site do you want to connect to. Okay. All right. So here's our site. Now I need to go through and add in. Let's see. I'm going to add in a new web part, which is the one we just created. I'm going to add a visual web part. And you see here my visual web part, there's the drop-down list that I got with all the products that start with the letter M, right? So pretty easy to go through and do this, right? Just you look at it and just say, well, hey, that's not that bad. This doesn't really, it goes to stop debugging here. This doesn't really even feel so much like SharePoint, right? So it really does lower the barrier entry to where you don't have to have as much SharePoint institutional knowledge of how the product works just to be able to get in and start being a good SharePoint developer and getting data in and out. This is one option. This is when you're doing something on the server. Your other option is you want to do stuff from the client. So in that case, let's go through and close all this, and let's talk about what the client side stuff is. Actually, let me just do. Let me show you one more thing here. If I want to go through and I want to create new items, this is kind of cool. So if I say like products item is a new products item, and then I can go through and I can create a brand new product by saying item.title equals some new product. And then we'd say, oh, I don't want to say item.title, sorry. I say, what's the other thing we say? Price would be like, $12.95 or something. Now, what's cool about this, I take those, I then say products drop-down list dot let's see, add, what was it again? Oh, I haven't done this in a little bit. Products, or is it items? Add a new, this time collection, add this item, and then I think I just say, or is it data context? Data context dot add product items, and for some reason it's not showing it to me. Products dot. There's a really easy way to add an item, and I can't remember off the top of my head. I'll go back and I'll do it. It's not like you don't do like this. Say items dot add. You could do it this way, but there's a different way you're supposed to do it. It's a little more strongly typed. And then at the very end, you say data context dot submit changes, and it goes through and saves all your changes back to the list. So you can see like writing back to the list is also a heck of a lot easier. Okay, so sorry about that. I can go through and find that code. Let's see. So the next thing we're going to do here is let's go through and let's talk about working from the client. So we're done with server side. Let's look at the client side. So there's two things I want to do show you about going through and getting data in and out from the client side. One way that we can do this is using the client object model, and the other way we can do it is using the RESTful service. So let's look at the more, I guess, SharePoint specific one, which is the client object model. So the first thing I need to do is add some references to my project for the client object model. So I'm going to come over here and say, let's add a new reference, and I need to find the client object model. that's going to be inside of the SharePoint Common Files, Microsoft Shared, Web Server Extensions, 14, a SAPI, oh, sorry, not a SAPI, template, layouts, client bin, and then right there. Makes a lot of sense, right? It's okay. It's all in the SharePoint SDK, so you don't have to keep track of that. Now, I had to add two things here because one of them is the actual object model, or the client object model. The other one is the transportation mechanism that knows how to serialize the request back to and make the call back to the WCF service, and then get the data back and hydrate the object model with the result that came back. So you do have, there's two different pieces there that you end up having to do. Okay. So let's go through and let's show you how to go through and get the data out of this. So what I'm going to do here is let's show you. I'm going to use one of the DevExpress controls. We're going to add a grid to the page. So I'm going to go add the DevExpress grid control. I think it. Oh yeah, here we go. So it's adding all my assemblies here, and then we're going to come back over here into the XAML, and I'm just going to get rid of these margins. All right, and we'll say stretch for both the vertical and horizontal alignment. Okay, so there we go. And we're going to switch this guy from a grid over to a stack panel. Okay, so now that we have this, now we've got our grid set up, let's come over here and back into the code behind for this guy. And on the initialize, when we go through in the constructor, let's go through and let's create a new method here called bind products to grid with client OM. Okay. And actually, let me think here for a second. Actually, I'm going to use the grid in a minute. I don't want to use it just yet. So we're going to go through and do this one. Bind products to grid. We'll just do let's bind products to list box. We'll just do that for the first one. So let's just go back and add a list box. So just let me go through and type a few things out here. Now we'll do the vertical. Uh-oh, what did I hit? And we'll save our changes there, go back to design mode, come back into code, and we'll just go through and do this in the list box. So let's go in. Now what we're going to do here is I want to go through and I want to connect and show the data using the client object model. Now, the first thing I have to do here is I have to establish a data context that I'm going to connect to. So there's a thing called the client context inside of the SharePoint client object model. And this is the thing that's going to be used to talk back and forth to the server. So I'm going to create my context here, a new context. And when I do that, I can pass in a URL pointing to a SharePoint site that I want to connect to. So I could go through and I could say I want to connect to this site right here, like that. Now, that's all fine and good, but what if I want to go through and change this? I'd have to rebuild it and put a different URL in it. That's not very friendly, so I want to make it more dynamic. Do I want to go through and I can go through and have my site actually, the thing that launches the Silverlight player, I could pass in as a parameter. That's kind of a pain though to do that. What about if I want to just connect to the existing site that I'm currently in? Well, what's nice is that Microsoft was kind enough in one of the later betas of the product to add in something new called the current property. And what that does is that just says, go get the URL of the current site and just create a client context and hand it back to, we'll use that one for this guy. Okay? So we're good there. And if I'm not mistaken, he's disposable. So we'll go through and make sure that we're good little citizens here. Okay. Now, what I want to do is let's go through and let's create a query that's going to do the same thing we did a second ago. From P in the context, from P in the context.products. No, sorry, I can't do LINQ. The reason I can't do LINQ here is because the client object model doesn't have any knowledge of the site that I'm connecting to, okay? It doesn't have any knowledge of the site I'm connecting to. So I've got to go through and I've got to build up a query using camel and being a little more verbose here in my query, which is it kind of stinks here, but it's just one of the things you have to kind of deal with. So I'm going to come over here and inside my using statement, I'm first going to get a reference to a SharePoint list. So I'm going to say get a reference to a list, which is my products list, and that's going to be in the context.web.lists collection, and we're going to get the list by the title called products. The next thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to create my query. So I'm going to create a camel query, and this query is view XML. This is kind of like my think of this as kind of like my select statement here, okay? Select statement in order by and all wheres and all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to create a view. I want to order by the field named title, order by query view. So remember, you can't use LINQ when you're using the client object model, which kind of stinks. And I'm going to go through and say I want to get all the items back. So we're going to say products, product list dot get items, and pass in that query. Now, what's cool about this is I have full control over when this thing is going to happen. Right? It has not gone to the server yet. So what I want to tell SharePoint to do is they're going to tell the client object model, when you go back to the server, I want you to hydrate this object right here, this products object. And the way I'm going to do that is by saying, tell the context, I want you to load this object called products that I just created. So that's going to go through and that's going to fill that up. So it kind of, think of it kind of like working backwards through the code. It's going to say, oh, I need to run this thing right here. I need to know, go on the products list, which is defined up here. So go get that products list. I'm going to run this query, which is defined up here. And when I do that, I'm going to fill up this collection here. So this is just saying I want to queue up this instruction here. Now I'm going to tell the client object model to go do the work. Go back to the server and go do all your work. I'm going to do that by saying context.execute query asynchronously. And I'm going to use, let's see, a little lambda expression here, sender args. And this is, I'm going to have to pass in a success callback or success handler. And I'm also going to have to pass in a fail callback. So what happens when he fails? Okay. Somebody asked what Visual Studio extensions are you using with Visual Studio helps with coding? DevExpress's Code Rush and Refactor. I'm using those, right? So you definitely want to go through and it's not a Code Rush webinar, but you definitely got to go check out Code Rush if you haven't seen it before. Just go to DevExpress's website for more information. Okay, so when things fail, well, we really don't care, right? Right now, we don't really care. So I'm just going to go through and leave things kind of as is. We'll just say, let's see, when it's asynchronous, we're all working on the background thread right here. So I got to switch back and get on the UI thread. A quick little trick of doing that is create this thing called a synchronization context. And what he does is when our application loads, we're going to set him to the current UI thread. And so we'll say, hey, when you're back on that, when you're now on the background thread, go back and I want you to post back to the UI thread. I want you to go run this code here. Fail sender, pass in some stuff here. I want you to go through and say message box dot show error happened. We'll just leave it at that. So here we go. So there's that. Let's see. Something that doesn't like something I did there. Oh, I got to pass in the arguments there. So args.exceptions. We'll just pass in the exception like that. Okay. So just pass something back. Okay. So now our failure handler is done. Let's go through our success handler. What is he going to do? So in here, I want to check to see, well, if the products collection is not equal to null, then I want to go through and show something. So we're going to say, I want to say the sync context, let's post, and we're going to actually create the handler here on products loaded, passing in products. We'll go generate this guy. And what do we want him to do? Well, the first thing we have to do here is we have to change the list item collection. We have to take that coming from this state thing that's coming back and say we'll cast him as a list item collection again. And then I'm just going to say listbox1 dot item source is equal to the products. Okay? So if I take this guy and build him, he's going to generate a zap file for me, and then I should be able to drop him on, upload him to SharePoint. Come on. There you go. Succeeded. So let's come back over here to SharePoint. Let's go into this document library here. There's lots of places you can go through and put your zap files in SharePoint. I'm just going to stick it in a document library just for speed right now. So let's find that zap that we just created. There it is. Grab the URL to this guy. And I'm going to go back to the home page of my site. Let's just go back to here. And I'm going to get all the web parts off the page. I'm going to add a new web part that SharePoint ships called the Silverlight web part, which is in media and content. And I will drop in my zap file, and it should show me a drop-down list. It didn't show me my drop-down list. There you go. It shows me a drop-down list with all the different items in it. Now, the reason why it didn't show me, it's not going through and showing me all this stuff is because this object I passed in doesn't have strong properties, and I haven't built an item template for it. But that's just standard Silverlight development. I just wanted to show you how easy it was to get stuff to be pulled back. However, one of the cool things here is that, as you see, we're going to go back and we're going to build something now with the REST model. And what REST is going to allow us to do is I'm going to go through and bind it to the grid, the DevExpress grid. And what's cool about that is that it's going to give me the ability to it's going to have strong properties because it's going to be based off of the context, the RESTful context, right? So I'm going to go through and I want to add in a reference to that RESTful service. So I'm going to say let's add a service reference. And what I want to do is go add a reference to a specific service on my site, intranet.wingtip.com/clientom, and then all web services are in VTI_bin, and we'll pass in, listdata.svc, and I'll hit go. And when it comes back, it'll find my service, and we're going to just call him ClientObject Model site OData. OData. Okay. Now we've got our service reference. So I'm going to say, create a new thing here called bind products to grid. Now, the first thing I want to do is I'm just going to switch the order of these two guys around and put the grid up top because it's going to, I'm not going to spend a lot of time reformatting my Silverlight, so we just want to look at data access here. Okay. All right. So I'm going to come back over here, and I'm going to say in the grid here, I now want to go through and start pulling data back from that RESTful service. So the way I'm going to do that is like any other RESTful service. I'm going to say first go through and create a new data context I'm going to connect to. So client OM client side data, create a context. Let's see, .entities, I think. We got there's my context right there. Create a new context. and we need to pass in a URI, which is going to be the URL to our site that we want to connect to. And that just happens to be this ClientObject Model site right here. Right? So I'm going to take him and actually point to the _VTI_bin, the actual service that we're going to connect to. Okay? And we'll just clean that up a little bit. Okay, let's go full screen here, give us a little more room. All right, so the next thing I want to do here is let's create our query. So var query equals from p in context.products order by p, order by the title, select p. I can do LINQ here because the context that was generated by Visual Studio is generating a bunch of collections that implement IEnumerable. Okay, so we can go through and actually write LINQ queries against RESTful stuff. I'm going to create a new thing called a data service collection, which is given to us inside of the, oh, am I missing a reference here? I think I'm missing a reference. No, data service there. Data service collection. What don't you like? System.data.services.client.data service collection. Wasn't resolving that for some reason. I'll go through and we want to look at a products item. Okay. So I'll go through and say data collection equals a new data collection, product item. I'm also going to create something called a collection view source. There we go. Now my Alt Shift F10 is showing up in my using options there. So here's my products collection view source. And this is what we're going to bind to the actual grid. Now, what I want to do is before I actually tell it to go get data, I'm going to tell it what to do when it finishes getting the data because it's going to be an asynchronous call. So I'm going to say that data collection, I want you, when your load completed event fires, I want you to do the following. I want you first to go through and say, take that products CVS, your source property, I want to set that to whatever came back, which I know is going to be of that type. I then want to go to the grid that we add to the page and set the data source equal to the product collection view source's view property. And then when we're all done there, I want to say data collection, I want you to go get your data using this query that we just created a minute ago. Okay? And that would be the REST way of going back and going and getting that data. Let's go back to our grid really quick and make sure that we tell it to go through into, yeah, I'm missing one thing, auto populate columns. So let them go, let the DevExpress grid build all the columns out for us. So I'll come over here and rebuild the project again. We'll wait for this to say succeeded. Come on. All right. We'll go back to our document library and upload a new copy of our Silverlight Zap. Someone asked a minute ago, shouldn't that have been a relative reference that I added to the Silverlight Zap? And the answer was yes. I just throwing it together pretty quick here. So yeah, it definitely could have been relative. Default.spx, and we should see a grid. There we go. Show up with some data, and I'm stuck in this little web part here. Let's see if we can make this guy a little bit bigger. I think by default it's only going to show up like 300 by 300. Yeah. So let's go height. We don't really care. 400. Let's say 600 to see more data. And there we go. Now we're seeing a little bit more data showing up here, right? You see more data, and you get the full capability of the DevExpress grid, right, of all the data coming back. So pretty easy to go through and pull that data back from REST. I mean, you can go through and see all the stuff that you have access to at that RESTful service by just going through and typing in VTI bin list data to SVC and start pulling data back the same way you would with any other OData service or RESTful service. Products, look at product number 1, right, and just see all that stuff by pulling it back. But the cool thing here is that the nice thing is that when I look at the code here for my Silverlight application, none of this right here says SharePoint. Right? None of it screams SharePoint. And in fact, if it wasn't for the fact that I actually added some ClientObject Model stuff in earlier, I wouldn't have any kind of references in my project to anything with SharePoint. So if you're used to working with RESTful services, you're going to do the exact same thing you're used to doing with SharePoint. You just have to go through and have the URL to the SharePoint service. What's also cool about this stuff, about the ClientObject Model, about LINQ, LINQ for SharePoint on the server, and also with the RESTful service, it respects all of the security and permissions that have been set up inside of SharePoint. So this is all using the administrator account that I've logged into my virtual machine with. If I logged in using another account, it would be using the identity of that user to get into those different things. If you want to impersonate somebody, you can do that, but it has nothing to do with SharePoint. It's just like if you would impersonate someone else trying to get into another web service. Okay. All right, so that's everything I had to show. I'll take this code and save it off, and then I'll post it to my blog for everybody to go ahead and download when we're finished with this. I guess we got a few more minutes here. I'll go back to the DevExpress guys and see if they would like to kind of have any kind of parting thoughts before I go back and answer some of these questions here.
Hey, Andrew. I think you can go ahead and get to your questions.
Okay, thanks, Amanda. All right, well, first, thanks everybody for sticking around here. So let me go through and let me answer some of these questions that are here. Let's see. One person said, you've just tubed, where did the products come from entity model? Oh, I'm guessing that you came in when I was doing the server side one, and where did this entity collection come from? I ran this little batch file right here that ran this SP metal utility that generated the code file for me. So if you just watch this webinar again, you'll see how I generated that. But there's a tool that SharePoint ships with that gives that to you. Let's see here. Oh, tuned. You change it later. Let's see. When do you decide to use these client object model instead of the server object model? This is a really easy question. Server object model, if my code is running on the same box where SharePoint's installed, I'm going to use server because I'm on the box and it's going to be a lot faster. Client object model, when I'm off of the server and I want to talk back to SharePoint from a client, being a server that doesn't have SharePoint installed, or like a Silverlight or a JavaScript thing, a JavaScript application that's going to be running on the client machine. Okay, so that's when you want to use the two different options that are available to you. Can you use a data site to create LINQ entity model and connect to the production site with the exact same schema but a different URL? Yeah, you definitely can. You just have to make sure that the schema exists in both of your sites. So you just create the same list in both your development and your production site, and you can just go through and change the URL and connect to each one. That's the whole reason why why the SharePoint team gave us the ability to pass in the URL as like a connection string. Think about it the same way you would think about like a dev database and a production database. Okay, the exact same way. Let's see here. Do I plan to show the REST client? Yes, I did that. LINQ can be used in the client object model. So you're right, but the reason why I say you can't use LINQ is because you don't have when you show people LINQ for SharePoint, they immediately think, oh, I can write the same queries in the client object model, and that's not true. The thing is that some of the things in the client object model are implemented as enumerable collections, and those things that are handed back, you'll be able to go through and write LINQ on those guys. There's another way of getting data back where you can pass in a iQueryable object, so basically a LINQ query, but it's not as full featured as you have with like LINQ for SharePoint. It doesn't understand any of the typing and any of that kind of stuff, or the actual property names inside of the different lists. You can go use like LINQ against like the SharePoint list collection, or with the generic items collection, but you can't say look for the first name property on a contact list. So I hear what you're saying. I see the link that you passed in, but it's not the same thing. It's like, just think about more as like LINQ for SharePoint versus like LINQ for objects. You can do LINQ for objects inside of the client object model the same way you can inside of Silverlight. You just don't get at the full like fidelity of your underlying data schema. Let's see. Can we use Camel as a mail merge source in a Word doc? I'm not sure how to answer that. If you're looking to do a mail merge, if Word can pull data from a web service, then you're probably going to want to use the RESTful service, because you can't like use a different library. Camels are going to require you going through and adding a bunch of references and stuff. And I don't think Word has a native understanding of that stuff in SharePoint. Can we get a link to the example client object model using ECMAScript and jQuery? Yeah, I'll go through and I'll put a when I put the blog post up, I'll tell you where both of them are. I mean, if you don't want to wait for that one, if you go to my company website, criticalpathtraining.com, there's a members section. You're going to have to log in. If you don't have an account, you just create a free account. That signs you up for our newsletter, which you can opt out of later if you like. But you go to the members section and look in the code downloads, or look in the presentations. It's either the code downloads or the presentations. Just look for AC's, that's me, Andrew Connell. Look for AC's client object model demos. And there's one where I've got a product browser that's a WPF, Silverlight, and JavaScript with jQuery implementation, pulling back data from the two lists that you saw a second ago. So I'll let you know where I'll put more information about that on the blog post later this afternoon. It might be later tonight, tomorrow, something like that. So just give me like the rest of the day tomorrow to get that up. Let's see. Using visual web parts, is it possible to have a web part with connections, consumer and provider? Yeah, you definitely can. The only thing that's different about a visual web part from a traditional web part is that all it does is just kind of stub out for you the fact that you're going to build a user control, and your web part is going to dynamically load that user control and add it to the controls collection. The user control is not a web part, so that's the visual piece. What you have to do is you have to go in and in the web part create provider and consumer connection points to pull the data, to be able to share data and pull the data in and out of the two different web parts. When you're building web parts like that, don't look to the SharePoint documentation, look to the ASP.NET documentation. SharePoint doesn't give you anything special about doing web parts. It's 100% ASP.NET. SharePoint completely relies on the ASP.NET framework for that. I see a few more questions here. I'll tell you what, I'll do 3 or 4 more questions, and then I'll go through and cut it off so that, because I know that we set up the webinar for 60 minutes, and I want to be mindful of everybody's time. So I'll do these, I guess I see 5 more questions in here, one from, the last one from Praven. So I'll answer these, and then we'll be done. If you have any other questions going forward, you feel free to shoot me a message on Twitter or through my blog. Let me put that slide up that I had a little bit ago, so you have a way to contact. Okay, so let's see here. I know you don't have time to show the jQuery method. Can you include example in the code you put on your blog? Yeah, that's easy. So I'm going to send you a link to where you can get that. It's got the client object model for ECMAScript and jQuery UI for a dialog. Can I display the SharePoint document library data in a different no SharePoint facing website using client object model? You can. What you would do is in your project you have to add reference to the client object model. It depends if you're doing it server side or client side, because you add reference to the .NET client object model or the Silverlight or the JavaScript client object model. So you can't do it. JavaScript client object model can only be used on SharePoint pages. It can't be used from outside of SharePoint. But that doesn't stop you from using standard jQuery and asynchronous techniques to connect to the RESTful service. But yeah, you can use those to connect the .NET or the Silverlight client object model to connect back to a SharePoint server and actually pull data from, like, say, a hypothetically, like say a PHP-based website pulling data back from SharePoint. WCF service which created, can it be used with integration for BizTalk? I'm assuming you're asking about the RESTful service, and I don't have enough knowledge about BizTalk, but if BizTalk can talk to RESTful services and use that as a data source, then sure. It's just a RESTful service. There's nothing SharePoint specific about it. Let's see here. Can external lists be accessed through the same methods or only some of them? They can. They're just a little special. You can't, like, the names of them are, the internal name of an external list is a little bit different. This kind of goes off on the big, it can get to like a rabbit hole of a topic here. So all I would say is go look in the SharePoint SDK. You can definitely go through and pull data back using these techniques. You just need to go through and do a little bit of research there. So sorry I can't give you the quick answer for that. How does SharePoint Metal generate lookup columns from a different list? If I had gone through and I didn't pass in that parameters file that told it to only generate the model from those two lists, then it would have done it for all the lists on the site. So you kind of specify. By default, it gets everything. I just specified to say only give me a few things. Don't give me everything. And that's about it. So I want to go ahead and thank you guys again for sticking around and coming to the session. Also, a special thank you to the guys for everybody who came in yesterday. Hope you guys got a lot out of this. Showed you how easy it was to kind of get data in and out of SharePoint. I think the coolest part about SharePoint 2010 is they spent a lot of time with data access, and they made it to where you don't have to have as much SharePoint institutional knowledge to be able to get data in and out. Specifically, the whole REST piece. That makes it so much nicer that now you don't have to have any SharePoint knowledge to get data out. So with that, I guess I'm done, and hope to see everybody soon.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you so much, Andrew. Like Mehul, I think he says in the questions, you do epic webinars. So thank you very much for being here. And just to let you know, tomorrow, Thursday, is an Ask DevExpress webinar on VCL with DevExpress CTO Julian Bucknell. It's a Q&A session with the VCL team on our plans for our continuing support for all things Delphi and C++ Builder. Come join us and grill us on how we see the VCL control marketplace expanding through 2011. And Friday, DevExpress MVC Grid View extension overview. Learn the basics of the MVC Grid View extension with ASP.NET evangelist Mehul Harry. We have a full lineup of webinars currently scheduled through March. Check them out at devexpress.com/webinars. And again, if you missed anything from this webinar or you want to review yesterday's SharePoint webinar, you can visit us at tv.devexpress.com. Again, thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you for choosing DevExpress.